In a war defined by missiles, bridges, and shipping lanes, one of the most dangerous targets may be dangerous precisely because nobody can afford to hit it. Bushehr is Iran's only operating nuclear power plant.
However, repeated attacks on the Bushehr nuclear power plant.
With the Bushehr plant site hit, critics warn that the US and Israel are now dangerously flirting with the possibility of a nuclear disaster.
It sits on the Gulf Coast, inside a province already struck during the current war. In March, a projectile hit the plant's premises. The reactor was not damaged, no radiation escaped. But the strike proved that the nightmare was no longer theoretical. Then Russia made a decision that changed the calculation. After evacuating hundreds of employees, Rosatom began sending specialists back to Bushehr in July. The first group was tiny, 6 people, but strategically, 6 Russian nuclear workers can matter more than an entire battalion. Because Bushehr is not only Iranian infrastructure, it is a Russian-built reactor supplied with Russian fuel, supported by Russian expertise, and tied to Moscow's reputation as a nuclear power. So the central question is this: has Russia turned Bushehr into a tripwire, one that could transform an American strike on Iran into a direct crisis with Moscow? Russia is not automatically going to war. The mechanism is more subtle. To understand it, we need to look at 3 layers: Russian lives, Russian technology, and Russian credibility. Bushehr is unusual because its history is physically embedded inside the plant. Construction began under the Shah in the 1970s with German involvement. The revolution and the Iran-Iraq war froze the project. In the 1990s, Russia stepped in, adapted the unfinished structures, and installed a VVER 1000 pressurized water reactor. The result is a hybrid site: Iranian territory, a Russian reactor design, and parts inherited from the German project. Unit 1 entered commercial operation in 2013. Russia supplies the nuclear fuel, and the arrangement calls for used fuel to be returned to Russia. The plant operates under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards. Rosatom is also building 2 additional units, though construction has been disrupted by the war. That matters because Bushehr is different from Iran's enrichment facilities. An enrichment plant contains nuclear material and sensitive equipment. An operating power reactor contains a hot core that must be cooled, electrical systems that must remain available, and trained personnel who must make correct decisions under pressure. The IAEA has warned that a direct hit on Bushehr could cause a very high release of radioactivity. It has also warned that disabling the external power lines could, in a worst case, lead to core damage. So Bushehr is not simply another square on a target map. It is a machine that must be kept alive. A tripwire does not need to stop an attack physically. Its purpose is to make crossing a line uncertain and politically expensive. Bushehr now has 3 overlapping tripwires. The first is human. Russian citizens and Rosatom employees may be present. The second is technical. The reactor, fuel relationship, construction program, and operating knowledge are deeply connected to Russia. The third is political. Moscow has publicly warned Washington that military activity near the plant could have irreparable consequences. Together, they create a decision problem for the United States. Even if Washington intends to hit only nearby military infrastructure, it must consider blast effects, debris, power loss, communications failure, frightened operators, and the possibility that Moscow interprets the incident differently from the Pentagon. This is how a civilian facility becomes strategic terrain, not because it fires missiles, because it changes who is involved when the missiles land. At the beginning of the war, Rosatom evacuated families and non-essential personnel. Construction on Units 2 and 3 was halted. In early March, Rosatom said 639 Russian personnel remained in Iran. Over the following weeks, hundreds more were withdrawn. By July, Rosatom began a phased return. That return creates what strategists call an entanglement risk. Suppose a strike damages a warehouse near the plant, but leaves the reactor untouched. If no Russians are hurt, Moscow can condemn the attack, evacuate staff, and pressure Washington diplomatically. But if Russian specialists are killed, the political character changes immediately. The Kremlin would face immediate questions. Were Russian citizens knowingly placed in danger? Did Washington receive warnings? Was the strike accidental, negligent, or deliberate? And what does Russia do if it allows the deaths to pass without consequence? None of this guarantees a Russian military response. Russia and Iran have a 20-year strategic partnership, but it is not a mutual defense treaty. Moscow is not legally required to enter the war on Iran's side. That is the strongest argument against the tripwire thesis, and it is partly correct. But a tripwire is not an automatic war clause. It forces a new decision. Russian casualties could produce responses below direct war, more intelligence support, faster air defense transfers, diplomatic retaliation, cyber pressure, or military deployments designed to signal that the next strike will cost more. Those are possibilities, not predictions. The key point is that American planners would no longer be calculating only Iran's reaction. They would be calculating Russia's. The second tripwire is built into the machinery. Rosatom did not sell Iran a finished object and walk away. Bushehr represents decades of Russian engineering, fuel supply, technical assistance, and institutional involvement. That creates two forms of exposure for Moscow. The first is physical. Russian specialists may possess knowledge essential to maintenance, construction, and safe operation. Even where Iranian operators are in charge, the wider system depends on spare parts, documentation, engineering advice, and a cross-border supply relationship. The second is reputation. Rosatom sells projects around the world by presenting Russia as a state capable of supporting reactors for decades. If a Russian-designed plant becomes the site of a preventable nuclear accident during war, the damage would not remain inside Iran. Every government considering a Rosatom project would ask what Russian guarantees mean when conflict begins. This is why Moscow has demanded what it called a safety island around Bushehr. Russia is protecting people, but it is also protecting an industry, and Washington has its own technical problem. Precision weapons can strike precise coordinates. They cannot guarantee precise consequences inside a complex system. A missile that misses the reactor may sever electricity. A blast may damage switchgear, cooling support, fire response, or communications. Operators may evacuate at the wrong moment. Backup systems may fail for reasons no satellite can see. The danger is not only a dramatic direct hit, it is ordinary systems failing under extraordinary pressure. The third layer is credibility. Russia has spent years presenting itself as Iran's strategic partner and as a defender of sovereign states against American military pressure. But Moscow's partnership with Tehran has limits. Russia has avoided a formal promise to fight for Iran. It has relationships elsewhere in the region. It does not want an uncontrolled confrontation with the United States. That restraint is real. Yet, Bushehr compresses those contradictions into one location. If Russia remains silent after its personnel or flagship technology are struck, Iran and other partners may conclude that Moscow's protection stops exactly where danger begins. If Russia responds too aggressively, it risks a direct clash with the United States. That is the credibility dilemma. Washington may believe Russia will stay cautious because Moscow has too much to lose. Moscow may believe Washington will stay away from Bushehr because America has too much to lose. Deterrence works only while both sides interpret the signals correctly. The closer military operations move to the plant, the smaller the margin for misunderstanding. There is a reasonable objection. Russia has watched Iran absorb devastating attacks without entering the war directly. It evacuated many workers. Its treaty contains no mutual defense clause. And Moscow has strong incentives to avoid fighting the United States over a facility it does not formally own. All true. So Russia has not transformed Bushehr into an impenetrable shield, but that was never the real claim. A tripwire matters because the attacker cannot be sure where the defender's threshold lies. Would Moscow tolerate a strike on an empty construction site? Probably. Would it tolerate the death of one Russian engineer? Maybe. Would it tolerate dozens of Russian deaths, damage to an operating reactor, and a regional radiological emergency after repeatedly warning Washington? That is where certainty disappears. And in military planning, uncertainty is itself a cost. This brings us back to the central question. Russia has not made Bushehr untouchable through a formal alliance. It has made Bushehr harder to strike around, harder to isolate politically, and harder to treat as an exclusively Iranian problem. For Washington, the rational approach is not simply avoid the reactor building. It must account for the entire safety system: external power, cooling, emergency access, communications, trained staff, and routes used to evacuate or reinforce them. It must maintain deconfliction with Moscow and IAEA visibility, because there are 3 escalation paths. In the first, another near miss causes no casualties. Russia condemns it, removes personnel, and presses for a protected zone. In the second, Russian citizens are killed, but the reactor remains safe. Moscow may answer asymmetrically, strengthening Iran while avoiding direct combat. In the third, a strike threatens the reactor or causes radioactive release. At that point, the crisis is no longer framed as America versus Iran. It becomes a nuclear emergency involving Russia, Gulf states, the IAEA, and every government downwind. None of these outcomes needs to be intended. A pilot can follow orders, a missile can hit its coordinates, and the war can still change category. This is the point where the story changes. The tripwire at Bushehr is not a Russian soldier standing beside an Iranian missile launcher. It may be an engineer checking a coolant pump. It may be a technician restoring a power system. It may be a fuel contract, an emergency phone call, or 6 specialists returning while explosions echo across the province. That is why Bushehr matters. Russia does not need to promise war in advance. It only needs to make the aftermath of an attack impossible to contain. And America cannot assume that because Moscow avoided escalation yesterday, it will make the same choice after Russian blood is spilled or Russian nuclear technology is placed at the center of a catastrophe. The line around Bushehr is not a clear red line. It is worse. It is a line whose location may only become visible after someone crosses it. If you value calm, evidence-based analysis of the forces reshaping this war, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.